Roger, maybe before we get into the specifics of the organizations, I think starting at a very high level is important here. And to your point, you've been on this TPA journey for 20 years, 20 plus years. So banging your head against the wall, trying to get people to understand this concept. And it just seems like most recently that the interest and the conversations have really accelerated. I know, speaking from CAIA's perspective, we had no idea that this would lead to so many conversations and roundtables and panel discussions and full rooms when we have these types of discussions. So as you take a look at kind of your own journey and your observations over multiple years, why is this such an important conversation and why is it happening now?
So basically, most of the arguments in the investment world are trying to capture the fuel in the theory, but also deal with the frictions at the same time. And the frictions have been uppermost with respect to how SAA has kept going, as it were. SAA is a tremendously durable governance model. It's very, very strongly positioned with respect to how governance works, but it hasn't really been investment efficient. It hasn't been investment efficient in new conditions. And so that particular point of, you could say, support the theory has just kind of percolated through more as people have encountered more and more challenges in today's investment environment. So there's obviously, I look at it through this tipping point theory. You can look at people like Malcolm Gladwell pointing this out, but there is this moment where there's a critical mass of discussion going on. And I can be absolutely clear about the fact that I've been talking about TPA this year twice as much as last year. There's no question in my mind. And the numbers of funds that are active has gone up a great deal as well. Less than 100%, by the way. Less than the doubling I've seen in terms of the conversations. So I think that's where we are. I think we're at a very interesting point. But really, from my point of view, all of my work is really trying to get the asset owners of the world to be as effective as possible in a purposeful world. And I just see TPA as actually kind of being an idea whose time has come.
So Jane, maybe pivoting to you a little bit, and when I looked at Roger's S-curve and you saw those early adopters, the innovative ones, aside from CPP, all of those asset owners sit in the APAC region, which is where you are primarily residing, but you're also working with other asset owners around the world. So could you maybe talk about what you've seen in terms of the broader Asia adoption and how that's kind of been exported to some of these other parts of the world, and just observations from that perspective?
All right, so I don't want to give you the wrong impression because they're not the majority, for sure. And I think it's probably safe to say that many funds are more conventional. But I would say that APAC has a lot of newer funds, right? So it's a newer region, it's emerging. You have a lot of funds that don't have 50 years or 100 years of history like you have in the UK. They might have 10 years or 20 years of history at most. GIC is probably one of the oldest ones. But future funds started in 2006, 2007, and so on and so forth. And so I think when you are in a situation where you're starting, you have some ability to be more innovative, to think with a blank slate. The other thing I think is, so that's the three founders that we were talking about that were on that S-curve. But for the remainder of my clients, they're copycats. Right? And they like to copy best practice. And so when you have most of your clients who are also government or sovereign wealth funds who feel like they want to learn from somebody, they're not going to go and visit a UK corporate pension fund or a US corporate pension fund. They're going to go and visit CPPI, or they're going to go visit Future Fund, or they're going to go visit New Zealand Super. And so what they've picked up and learned and started to aspire to has, I think for many years, at least for my clients, been just envy. I wish we could do something like that, but it's so hard. But then over time, as they've continually learned and watched and observed, I've seen a shift. So for the first time, funds that I've always thought of as never, ever being able to implement TPA are actually now starting to do so. I'm Korean. I came from Korea. I never thought that MPS or KIC would go for this. But both of them have now become TPA adopters. They're still very early. They're still trying to figure it out, but they have been very public about their intention to move that way. So that decision has been made now. So yeah, I think it's an element of both of those things, that early stage, we can do whatever we want. How are we going to start our fund? And then also we want to learn from the best. Who should we be benchmarking?
Well, I think that the delineation between those that are starting completely from scratch versus those that have an existing legacy governance structure and are now trying to make the move, those are two very different things. And I want to focus on that a little bit. Mads, maybe I can start with you. One of the things as we were going through these conversations with many of the asset owners that have that legacy system, the SAA and the governance structure that was in place and are trying to move to this new way of thinking and way of operating, there was a common refrain and some variation of this that popped up in most of our conversations, which is we want to move and evolve from measurement to trust or measurement to control, or control to trust in some instances. So maybe could you talk about that within your own organization and that evolution from a governance perspective of, the very kind of metric-driven way of governing versus taking a step back and delegating some of those responsibilities?
Yeah. So first, there's no sort of opposition between measurement and trust, because to gain trust, of course, you need measurement. You need to have numbers. You need to be able to talk to what you do. But from a governance perspective, when you think about sort of the SAA model that was sort of listed up there, as Roger said, that is a well-proven model, worked for many years. And from a governance perspective, sort of the top level, the board, have control. I mean, they can sort of see what goes on. They can see how it operates. So that sort of releasing that control is one of the things that sort of needs to be done. Now, in our organization, so that is a gradual process. So ensuring that you need probably both. Again, it's a people thing in terms of having a board that are open to new ideas or have faced a situation where the old model had some deficiencies. So should we try something new? So this is about sort of having those sort of the right people, the right situation, bringing that on into the business. So in Relpen, this process started, you could say, roughly 10 years ago, where there was that shift, and it was probably born out of sort of some of the deficiencies that happened during the financial crisis, that we couldn't move things around, so we need to rethink the model. So there was a driver for that, and there was openness to do this. So that has sort of put us on a track. And then it is about, we then have sort of to get the people in that could then sort of be on that journey and slowly evolve. Now, we have been on that journey for about 10 years now. We are far from there. We're not at level 5. I think you had as your highest one. But we definitely have all these elements that sort of characterize TPA are in our business. But it does require that you sort of go through these things and sort of basically relinquish that control that you have from the board and start to get that trust that you sort of need to do. But you build the trust through delivering results, talk about this, and doing it slowly.
So Bob, and I want to pick up on something Mads said there with the data, and there is a need for measurement in order to do this successfully. But in a lot of cases, when you move from that spectrum of pure SAA to something closer to TPA, you are kind of removing some of those constraints that are in place. And so some organizations will use some broad risk return profile that's in place. Others will use a more explicit reference portfolio, which at least gives some kind of parameters that are in place. But one of the things that was interesting in these conversations was that, you go through this step of removing all these different metrics that are in place. And then there's a natural temptation once you get there to start piling them back on again. Well, we've got a reference portfolio, but what if we add this asset class? Maybe we should add another benchmark to that reference portfolio, or maybe we should be more quantified in our risk targets. So I'd love for you to talk through a little bit more on how USS approaches this kind of balancing act of keeping it high enough level, but also having the appropriate KPIs that are in place.
Yeah, I think in terms of journey for us, it started similar to what Matt said, 10 years ago, where we adopted a reference portfolio. Our client adopted a reference portfolio for us, and our objective was just outperform that reference portfolio by X number of basis points within a single risk measure. It was just an AL sort of vol risk ratio against that reference portfolio. Sort of we found, and our client found, that was ultimately not in line with their ultimate goal, which was to pay pensions on time. So while we might celebrate, oh, we've hit the 55 bips outperformance or whatever it might have been, and our funding position was worsening, that wasn't really consistent with what our client wanted. That changed in 2020, where we removed that reference portfolio and probably more fully embraced TPA. So we get given a suite of KRIs, which are guided by risk appetite statements that our board ultimately set with the help of our CRO and our risk team. And that gives the onus to the executive to ultimately set that asset allocation. So we've gone from one KRI to a suite of KRIs, and we've gone from one measure of performance to a more holistic scorecard-based approach. I think at times, as sort of the team responsible for trying to deliver the fund's goals, that can feel like it's too much, but we think it's for the right reasons. And the way we try and balance that is we also give the advice to the client, and we have a regular, an annual review ultimately of what forms that scorecard. But we've gone from one too many and made that much more holistic, much more aligned with our client. And ultimately, at the moment, we think it works, and we have regular touch points to ensure that it remains suitable for our client and suitable for the needs of the business as well.
I want to come back to systems a little bit because that's an important part of this journey. But maybe, Bob, and sticking with you and Mads, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. One of the things is we've had these conversations and tried to clear up some misconceptions around TPA is this whole kind of trade-off in terms of your team structure. And in some instances, we've gotten responses like, well, do we just make everyone generalists then? If we're thinking about the overall portfolio, what's the need for specialists? But as we've talked with both of your organizations and other organizations, you still have specialists in that team structure, but you need that kind of cross collaboration that takes place. So maybe, again, Bob, and starting with you, talk about how the team structure shifted as you made that journey. And Mads, same question to you.
Yeah, so we've made one significant change in our sort of central strategy function, sort of start of this year, which was to bring together the team responsible for helping set the portfolio strategy, and the team, my old team, responsible for trying to deliver that and the implementation. We found that was not a very efficient model in TPA because really your implementation is so interlinked with your strategy, and vice versa. You can't set a strategy that just can't be implemented. So we made a decision to bring those two teams together and properly have a total portfolio management team. But alongside that, there's still challenges with the investment teams that actually run the assets internally. So we recognize the need for specialists. We recognize the need for generalists, and I see my team's role as trying to bridge that gap a lot and trying to bring both elements together. That's had varied degrees of success. Change is a slow process, and people are naturally averse to change. I think the other aspect that's a bit of a differentiator for USS is that we have no CIO. So we have a dedicated asset allocation committee, which is made up of sort of the 5 most senior investment professionals in the organization, sort of the heads of all the key areas. And they collectively have to think through what the asset allocation should be and how we should try and go about delivering that strategy, which is sort of a bit of a step away from what they're used to. And sort of we've gone further than that and tried to align compensation structures to help enable that to be the priority for them, as opposed to how is my business area doing. But to sort of just go back to your question, you're going to need specialists. We run complex portfolios. There are people who are going to need to understand the real detail behind a single infrastructure investment or single equity investment. But we want them to be thinking about things a little bit more holistically than just, this is great for my little mandate.
Mads, before you go, just a follow-up question for you, Bob. And the resistance that you saw, you said it's hard for some change, for some people to go through that change. Anything you can point to that's the most challenging and how you've overcome that?
Yeah, I think think the way to overcome it is conversation. I mean, everyone's well aligned in terms of what the goal should be. So everyone's compensation is ultimately linked to the outcomes of the fund now, as opposed to just their mandate. I mean, some people also have some linkage to a single mandate, and it's just about conversation and sort of you try and, for me at least, find one area where you can really have that success in terms of embracing TPA, and we found that a little bit more with our public equities colleagues, because we're trying to do something very different to MSCI World there, for example. And then people start picking it up naturally and understanding it in that sort of way and embrace it. You know, I think the thing that we're really keen on is not seeing this as us being big brother and dictating the overall strategy. We want you to come to us. We want you to embrace the competition for capital that makes this a success, and think about things. This is a good opportunity to do X, and we think that in the context of the overall portfolio, and not just because we want to run more capital or something like that.
Matt, similar question for you.
Yeah, so we have kind of been on a journey on this. So I mentioned that we embarked about 10 years ago, and the first wave was essentially to create multi-asset portfolios internally. So basically taking some of the decision power on asset classes down into the organization, which was one of the first steps, you could say, in moving towards TPA. And that worked well for a while. So we had this sort of multi-asset liquid portfolio and a multi-asset illiquid portfolio, and that was good. But they were then populated with specialists. So we just sort of created pool funds, but they were still sort of, they were the equity guys, they were the bond guys and so forth. So that, and they were in teams and they were not really talking to each other. So first wave worked sort of from a governance perspective, but not from a people and organization perspective. And then in second wave, we have then started sort of to think more broadly about the rest of the portfolio. In the period from first to second wave, our clients' needs have also changed. They need more diversified sort of approach. They need different approaches. We need to be sort of better to communicate to different types or deliver to different types of needs. So now we are sort of in the second wave and sort of looking into how we can do that. We have hired people in that have that total portfolio view. We have set up a total portfolio investment. It's a committee, or right now it's a forum because we are training it to be a committee. But it will be a committee so that we have oversight of the whole thing as well. So that has been the process that we have embarked on. Now, I see the total portfolio people that we have there. They are, you can call them generalists or you can call them specialists. I actually see them as specialists because they have that special skill that they are able to think across. And that's not everyone that has that skill. So you need to have both in the organization. So you don't get rid of your specialist. You still need somebody who is very sort of understands very well how real estate works when you do real estate investment and so forth. But you also need the different groups. And then you need them to be able to collaborate. So the big trick here is not, well, getting people in and finding people takes a while. You do that. That's cool. But then get them to collaborate and get the processes to work so that you actually deliver, sort of look at the total outcome and not just the silos as you did in the past. And that has been sort of, that's the journey we're on now, and we are definitely moving forward there.
I want to move a little.
Aaron, I'm going to come in with a comment there, which is really that this is a reboot of investment talent as I see it. So the reboot is really about that ability to be joined up with other colleagues. So that isn't necessarily the way that the investment industry has grown up. It's had more of a sort of star philosophy, but that is a real reboot. And it's really interesting. And in that respect, I'm fascinated by Bhavin's job title because I'm seeing so many, I call them CTPMO, Chief Total Portfolio Management Officers, as being now the new job description. And I think Mads has got the same job as well. So I think of this as being really quite an interesting sort of reworking of what is investment talent.
Yeah.
I think one other aspect which I neglected to talk about is we try and make all of the total portfolio information available to the entire business. So anyone can go on a dashboard and see, okay, well, how is the total portfolio position? Where do we have our exposures? And we encourage a lot of people to look at that. And not to be big brother, we do monitor who is looking at that and try and build on that. You know, we know the people who are then really trying to embrace it.
That leads me, Roger, I want to point this question to you. So we talked about systems. Bobbin just mentioned systems again. So there's a cultural element and a governance element of this, but then there's also the enablers of systems and dashboards and all the types of things that you can create. And it was interesting to go through some of these conversations of which one comes first within the organization. Some instances you have people in secret in the dark room that are trying to do this and build up to the governance conversation, and others which were much more kind of governance led, and then it goes down to the system. So talk through that trade-off and how you see this as a governance conversation and a cultural conversation versus a systems conversation.
Yeah, I think that's spot on that it's both. So from that point of view, governance and culture actually drive so many important things in investment, which actually we under-recognize. We're now coming to terms with that much more because obviously it's a superpower. Governance and culture are superpowers to make human intelligence more than just the straight sum of different people's skills. But the idea that we have to think in much more joined up terms because there are so many opportunities to get combinatorial value from people and from ideas and from portfolios. So that has become really, I think, a very big opening for organizations to do new work. And I'm kind of struck by this systems thinking thing because if you ask any CEO, is your organization a system? They will say, they will think a bit, but they'll say, yes, actually, we see ourselves as an organization as a system. That's what it is. And then you actually say, well, have you done a course on systems thinking? And they say, I hadn't really thought of it that way because it's kind of a natural growth of individuals who have the capacity to manage a lot of different moving parts. That's what basically systems thinking is. But there is the ability, I think, to recognize that there are things that systems thinking can teach you. And a good example here is that, in a sense, the iceberg model is out there telling us that we see certain measures which are only 10% of the story. There's a lot that's going on under the surface here. And if you torture the data, it will confess to anything. And that is really, one of the really important takeaways from systems thinking.
So Mads, staying on that journey, and again, whether it's trade-offs on governance and culture or systems, maybe talk through your own personal S-curve, to use Roger's visual of, there's an element with some organizations where it's gradual and then all of a sudden, you kind of jump over and move towards TPA. In other instances, there's a definitive decision. We want to go through this journey and we're just going to start and start to move forward. So as you look at Railpen and the journey that you went through, how did that gradual versus kind of an explicit move happen? And are there certain lessons that you learned along the way?
Yeah, so it was, I don't think that it was a very deliberate decision, say, now we do TPA and let's start sort of embarking on that and then follow the plan there. This is a gradual evolution that has happened over time. And there have been many elements in there. So basically the first the dialogue, thinking about benchmarks again versus basically, do you deliver the outcome or do you deliver to a benchmark, or the required outcome in the goal? And that sort of delivering to goals is a key thing that we added quite early in the process and have been been able to articulate. We didn't fully leave benchmarks. They were still there. They are floating around. For some reason, so to remunerate people, you need to have benchmarks and reference rates and stuff like that. And that was on a board level, to be able just to give that away was not fully acceptable. So it still exists, but it doesn't drive the big decisions anymore. So that was one of the things that we got where we started on this. We have also started on looking at the portfolio from a total perspective in terms of risk. So basically factorizing it or trying to see, well, we should not look at our our different, I mentioned our multi-asset pool funds. We shouldn't just look at each pool fund as a separate thing because they have common risks. And then how do you then, when you add them together from the client perspective, what is their total risk and not what is the risk in the single portfolios? So building a system that can actually do that. We have been, for 3 years, we have been implementing a risk system that can actually measure across all the asset classes. And that takes quite a while. So that's another part of the journey that you need to start on and things you need to do. And then there is the people part. So getting people in that have this understanding of how do you actually do this and sort of what is important, being able to communicate with those that were there in the old days and sitting in their silos and being specialists. And then sort of making sure that we now get on that journey. So those are the elements that we have added in the pod. There are more than that, but I'll stick to those three. These things are things we have done, and that gradually sort of moves us forward towards getting into a more and more TPA-like world. Will we get there fully? Probably not, but we will be on a journey towards that, and we will get the benefits that we see that can work in our organization. So it is, well, there are many elements in what you need to do and think about. But first of all, it comes back to people being able to think sort of in a holistic way and work together on that. And the second thing is to have that sort of tolerance to take that risk of doing something that is that's not ordinary. That you leave the SAA model and you move into something else. So basically building that trust with your board and get that room to start to move. Those are the things that I would say, look for them, because those are the ones that you really need in the long run.
Bobbin, first of all, congratulations on your promotion to CTPMO. That's a mouthful, but congrats on that.
Thank you.
Similar question to you, that explicit decision to move forward versus the gradual and then all of a sudden decision. How did that work?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a big bang for us. We had 7 years with a reference portfolio and realized that wasn't working for the client, and so moved forward in 2020 with a more holistic framework. It required a lot of convincing to the IC, the board ultimately, to take this step. Giving up control is obviously always a challenge, but once they came to the realization that actually in owning the reference portfolio, they're probably making the biggest decision that drives the outcome of the total portfolio. They all of a sudden didn't feel too comfortable doing that, knowing that there are a bunch of investment professionals in the organization, probably more capable of achieving that. So you got to have that, and then you got to have the right culture at the top. And as I said, sort of it's been set such that our heads of business area don't just get rewarded on what their business area is doing. In fact, if their business area is doing well, but the total portfolio outcomes are not, then sort of it's tough. They have to really be thinking in that sort of way, and the hope is then it sort of permeates down to the rest of their teams. But go back to what I was saying earlier. It's tough to change people. It's tough to get there, and I think it's just one of these things that will continue to take a while. But maybe just like Roger was alluding to earlier, a lot more people are talking about it. I found that sort of since I came back to this role at the start of the year, a lot more people in the organization want to talk to me. So that's almost a similar sign in that people maybe are thinking about this and are embracing this approach, because we've been at it for 3 years. They're probably now starting to get that, this does matter to them and their careers.
So Jane, maybe rounding this out on the journey and where Roger started, but as you're hands-on with all these different asset owners that are now all of a sudden interested, they want to go through this journey. What are some of those hurdles that they have to overcome, and any other observations of starting that journey, going from point A to point B?
I think that's the first problem, right? That people actually think there's a point A and there's a point B, and then there's this straight line that connects point A to point B, and then you're done, right? So the reality is, if you've read any good novel, you'll know that the journeys are always going to be full of tricks and hazards and all sorts of things. And we actually found that with the 12 funds. We were interviewing, the three of us were interviewing 12 funds, 2 of who are on stage right now. And I, actually loved hearing the story again, because you learn something new each time. But the reality is every single journey was different. And throughout that journey, there were perils. There were instances where it could have gone the other way, where you could have been dragged back into the SAA world. Even the most I'd say advanced funds who you would think are at a level 5, we're talking about this siren call back to SAA and being pulled back, that force of gravity. And so, I don't want to spoil it yet, but you're thinking, your quote in the article that's about to be published about how it's a little bit like swimming upstream. It takes effort, right? And constant, constant care, because it's very easy to slip back into old habits. And then when people change and the pool of talent where you're getting those new people in is more used to the SAA world, you basically have to re-educate everybody again from scratch. And so I think there's definitely that element. But in terms of the journey, I think what we're trying to do through this paper is to break it down into more manageable steps. Right. Earlier, Roger was showing you a grid that had these 5 pillars, and that will feature in the paper as well. But there's a reason that people was first. So you had people, then you had investment, then you had governance and risk and sustainability. I mean, I wouldn't put too much into the sequencing of that, but one of the commonalities we found when we were talking to 12 funds was that there was a risk of starting with investments. Or if you were trying to start with governance, it was too hard because you're basically taking control away from somebody who's used to being in control of something. And you don't have the new thing fully mapped out yet. So if you start there, you're immediately going to get shot down. On the investment side, what we found is people who had started there, making all these changes centrally within the strategy team and then coming up with overlays and completion portfolios and all sorts of things would end up stalling, because they hadn't figured out the people side or hadn't touched the governance side. They'd gone the lazy route. In fact, some of them were saying, we've been doing this for years, but we haven't been able to change, the thinking in the organization. And that's why we started with people. It's a mindset and it's a leadership issue. The leadership needs to believe in this total fund outcome, how important that is, and make it very central to the organization's reason for existence. And it's really only then that you have this impetus to get people to change their behaviors, because you are asking them to change their behaviors. So whilst I'm not saying that every journey started there, in fact, I'd say many of the journeys that we saw actually started maybe in the wrong places and then had to backtrack to solve for the people thing before they were able to gain ground. One very large fund in the US is a good example of this. I think that was what I learned from watching these journeys, the fact that even the best, even the 5s, we're talking about that challenge of being pulled back into the old world.
Well, it was very funny or not funny, it was very interesting to kind of hear how it's difficult to try to operate without that people element. So you can do all these things within your portfolio, but if you don't have the people on board, it's even more challenging than just adopting, or at least that's the way I took it, at least adopting TPA.
I mean, one more point I'd make is your first paper, right, touched on governance, factors, competition for capital, and culture.
Yeah.
When we did the next one, when we were talking to the 12 funds, the 2 that came out again were governance and culture.
Yeah.
Not so much factors and competition for capital. They were still there, but it wasn't 100% across the 12 funds.
Yeah.
Whereas governance and culture were pretty much constant throughout.
Let's focus on the portfolio. So the residual, to Jane's point of all this work that goes into adopting and making that transition along the spectrum of SCA, TPA, governance, culture. But then there's the portfolio that actually may or may not change, and there's ways that you can measure that. So I want to spend some time there, and then if there's time and if people have questions, certainly open to that as well. So Roger, I want to start with you on this, and this is kind of this was interesting to me on the framing as we were going through these interviews of the alpha versus beta conversation, or maybe more explicitly a relative return conversation versus an absolute return conversation. So help us with the framing of SAA versus TPA and everything in between with those.
Yeah, I think the thesis here is that we've grown up with a rather narrow version of how investment works. So in a sense, MPT and the other pieces of theory that have added together have actually sort of come from a bit of physics envy. We tried to have a unified field theory of investing, which actually has created this alpha and beta thing. I don't know if you kind of recognize, but people looked at alpha beta separation as really a very important proposition 10 years ago, but it's died out. So when you look at it that way, I think we do still have alpha in listed markets, but we don't have anything like that in private markets, and privite markets are much more the source of differentiated performance outcomes at the moment. They have been for a little while. So from that point of view, it is really about an absolute return. And so from that point of view, I think we are having to unlearn some of those sort of classic pieces of MPT, which is tough. You know, we're in the company of CAIA and CFA, and both of them really, I think, have to think hard about really exactly how our new talent will kind of grow up, understanding maybe that a total return approach involves looking at risk differently, and certainly it doesn't involve a huge amount of that concept of tracking error. And I'm going to call it out. I don't find volatility tremendously attractive as a risk measure, but it's still such a central plank for many portfolios that we have that sense about volatility. What about the term structure and risk? So what I think we've got with this TPA thing is really, this is a kind of sandpit to think about new stuff. It's really an opportunity to do that in a safe space. But what we have to see now is a bit of an opportunity for TPA to be a gateway to kind of new thinking. And I think from that point of view, I'm really passionate about the idea that risk can be thought about more deeply, and it can be measured more successfully than we have. So I think alpha and beta aren't dead, but I think they really are a very limited way of explaining the puzzle. One aspect of that is, of course, that beta beta is now part of system level investing. Beta beta. And we thought that beta was a given, but actually we have to now think about big institutions having some influence over the market return.
So speaking of the more unique and creative ways of managing the portfolio, to Roger's point, Mads, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, we've probably got a lot of asset managers in the room who are paying more attention to this as it becomes more prevalent for the asset owners. Talk through how moving towards TPA has shifted the way that you work with some of these GPs and asset owners or asset managers as you're trying to think through the overall portfolio rather than trying to fill a product into a sleeve.
Yeah, so I remember 20 years ago, we went to a very big bond manager in California. You can try to guess who that was. And we essentially tried to say, well, we would like to create a mandate that is more about sort of the total return, and you need to be able to allocate across your different asset classes and so forth. And it was just impossible to make them do that. It was beyond their business model. They had benchmarks, and that was it. And you buy portfolios sleeve by sleeve, and you can combine them, but they were not able to do anything on top of that. That's 20 years ago. Now, rolling fast forward. Now what we see is that when we engage with managers, external managers, it is about partnership. It's about sort of, they need to both manage our money in the way that is sort of fits the way that we think about it. They should focus on the right things. They should deliver the right data to us. But they should be partners with us. So they should also share information with us so that we learn from them and we can build out sort of our knowledge base and we can continue our journey in evolving the portfolio. So we are moving from just having a manager, which is essentially just deliver some return and you're all fine, into being a partner with us that we need to spend time on. And from our perspective, looking at managers that way, that's hard work. It's not, we spent just engaging that way, preparing in a different way for your manager meetings, setting it up as a discussion, getting actual valuable input to your business, and then bring it into your business and make it useful. That's hard work. But that's how we have tried to change our sort of approach to managers in this context.
So Bhavin, when we talked to all these different asset owners, TPA can be applied whether you do internal management or fully external management, and you have people on both sides of that spectrum. You all sit somewhere in the middle, as far as I understand. So, but as you move towards TPA, how have you thought about the trade-offs of what do I internally manage versus what do I partner with GPs in order to execute?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a pretty critical decision for us when we think about whether to manage assets internally or externally. The cliche, we try and think about it in the context of what's best for the portfolio, what skill sets we have internally. to do something versus what's available in the market that just isn't worth building a capability of internally. I think the key thing though for us is a little bit to what Matt said. I mean, it's maybe a little bit easier to integrate TPA for your internal team because you can just much more easily go talk to them and try and not educate them, but they have much more ability to see the picture because they see what's going on in the floor, they see the conversations at a senior level, and can make that happen. But I think partnerships with external managers is a pretty important one as well, in that they can provide us with more help than just the return. I think the other aspect to this is on the objectives that we set for everyone. So we've certainly moved quite far away from just here's an index, beat it by X and job done, because that's certainly not embracing TPA, to more scorecard-based approaches, considering what's really important. And that sort of extends beyond return. It sort of looks at things like responsible investment integration, what externality benefits you might be providing if you're an external manager. What else are you doing to contribute in the same way that Mads was? And we do that internally, and sort of for return, it's not just an index. I mean, an index is one lens, but total return or peers, especially for some of our private markets mandates, that's really quite an important input.
So Jane, round us out on the portfolio side of the equation. And again, one of the interesting observations was for people who made this journey and they started to think this way, it kind of opened up the toolbox and universe of all sorts of things that they could invest in, whether that was internally done or externally done. And one of the elements of this was the ability and willingness to take on more illiquidity in the portfolio. So could you talk through your observations working with some of these investors of the types of private assets and where the level of private assets has gone from the start to further along the journey?
So I don't have a clean answer for you on this one, Aaron, but I'm going to go to a public source that everybody here can access. Last year, my colleague Roger and Future Fund worked on a peer study. Now, we didn't just look at TPA. TPA was one of 10 topics maybe in that survey. But one of the interesting things that we found, because we were asking them about strategy and about governance and about sustainability and about TPA, of course, was that, and we didn't manufacture this, but a third of the survey respondents were in the SAA camp, a third were in the hybrid, were in between camp, and a third were basically in the TPA camp. And again, we didn't manufacture this, but when we looked at just the TPA adopters, not only was their performance higher, but they also had a higher percentage in alternatives. Now, it's not causality, but my theory is that TPA grew up as a form of extending governance, of strengthening governance, and funds who are able to do that. I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you want to do alternatives, you need more governance. You need more capabilities. You need more people, more time, more skill. And so I don't think there's, I think there is a reason that we see this trend, that we see that the TPA adopters, and we didn't even say that they were TPA adopters, they self-selected, right? And, the fact that their alternatives ratios were in the sort of 30 to 40% range relative to the SA adopters who were closer to 15%, 10 to 15%. And so, when you think about that, I feel that TPA, is an enabler for better and more efficient portfolio management. I don't think it means that people are just following the endowment model and putting a ton in privates. So I don't have a clean answer for you. All I know is that there's something there for sure. Yeah. But what I would say is we asked this question, right? We asked all 12 funds, how did this impact? And what we found was that the portfolios were completely different. Mm-hmm. We had some portfolios that were 80% liquid and other portfolios that were not doing any real estate and so on and so forth. And so the answer was really, it wasn't one answer across all the funds. But what was, I think, clear was that there was more fluidity and more ability to think outside of asset class buckets. And a good example of that, and I think a public one, was GIC. They have a strategic portfolio, policy portfolio, and a reference portfolio. And private debt is not part of that strategic benchmark. And yet they have a sizable allocation to private debt. And their total portfolio management head basically said that under the old SAA world, we would not have been able to go very much into private debt because we have some exceptions. We have some wiggle room to go beyond our strategic asset allocation, but not too far. But under TPA, suddenly that doesn't become a problem because you're looking at the underlying risk factors using that common language throughout so that the real estate team can contribute a bit to private debt and the private equity team can contribute and the fixed income team can contribute. And they're all contributing and they're all speaking the same language, but it's all managed centrally in terms of that allocation. And it's still within the risk budget. So one more final thought I'd leave with you on the portfolio side is something that we heard from actually an American fund. I won't name them, but the view was basically, you're in TPA land when all you're talking about is risk and not assets, right? With most funds, they're still talking about assets in dollar terms and how much they're allocating to this or that. But that was the comment. That you're in TPA land when all you're doing across the teams is talking about risk.
And I would even add, some of the more esoteric asset classes. I think one of the funds mentioned ILS. Like, where do you put that in a traditional SAA framework? But in a TPA framework, it may work because it's the incremental value add to the overall risk return profile. So there's some weird stuff out there that you can add to the mix as well.